Hello, everyone. Happy Wednesday. I'm just going to check Twitter really quick to make sure we are up and running there as well. All right. And Rockfin is all set and good to go. And I just want to give a couple shout outs to people in the chat. What is going on, everyone? 86 Blackberry White, welcome. Hello, Hannah G. Greg Bruce is a Sabs member. Shout out to Greg. All right, Julie said, yay, here for the Brad Sandler MMT. Cool. Welcome, Nadia. Welcome, Toasty Toast. Money Trees is the perfect place for shade. That's how I feel. What's going on? Delthea Simmons, who's a Sabs member. Good evening, everybody. Shout out to Radical Leftist Agenda, who's also a Sabby member, says, here we are. And shout out for the super chat. Thanks so much, Kami John. A little Wednesday night MMT talk. I love it. Thanks, Sabby, for bringing Comrade Sadler on. Keep up the great work. Thank you so much for the super chat. And thank you for joining all of us tonight. This is going to be a free education session tonight for all of you. Shout out to Eric, who's also a Sabby member. What's going on? Awesome. Cool. Welcome to Sabby Sabs Podcast. I'm your host, Sabrina Salvati. My special guest today is Brad. He is from Real Progressives. And tonight he is going to explain to you what many of you have been wondering about for a while. Modern monetary theory, also known as MMT. What is it? How does it work? And what are some of the things that people are saying about it? So, Brad, welcome.
Well, thank you. Glad to be on. Really, always fun to tell people about MMT, and it takes a little while sometimes, but after you go through it a few times, it clicks, and it all makes some sense to you. Just to kind of go over my background a little bit, I was in the private sector for my whole career. Most of the time I was working as a business system analyst for a major supermarket chain around here. And it's when the 2008 crisis hit, I thought to myself, I got to learn how our economy works. And so I started reading a whole bunch of books by Robert Wright, Paul Krugman, and I started defending them and pushing their point. Thanks to Barry. And one person just kind of said to me, hey, you're wrong. What these guys are telling you is wrong. I'm like, what are you talking about? And he gave me some information to look up, and I looked it up. It was by Ellen Brown, and found it to be a mishmash. But he also pointed me towards New Economic Perspectives, and that's where all the early MMT experts were producing tons of free material on the web. A little plug there. All that material is being moved over onto the realprogressives.org website, and it will stay for a long time. And that website will provide you with tons of MMT information. So what I'm doing here tonight is an introduction, an overview. I'm not going to get into a lot of the details, but I'm going to try to get you to understand why it's important to know, and at least have people realize that it's not what its detractors say.
Awesome.
So it's very different. And
Awesome.
Those are the kind of areas I want to cover and talk about. So if you want to start things off, Sabrina.
Yeah, absolutely. First and foremost, I want to give a shout out to Double K. Thank you so much for the super chat. I see a lot of new faces in the chat tonight. Welcome to Sabs podcast. If it's your first time here, so let's get this started. Let's first and foremost, Brad, please explain to people what exactly is MMT.
Okay, that's really a good question. And what it is a description of how a macro economy operates. In particular, it covers a certain number of nations that are what are called have sovereign fiat currencies. That means by law, their currency is created. In the United States, it's actually in our Constitution. The other requirements for it, and there's a few, is that the currency is free floating. That means it doesn't have a gold standard to be dependent upon, nor any other commodity, such as, I don't know, whatever, you name it. The value is whatever the government says. So $1 is $1. $10 is $10. And if you recall back a few years ago, there was a talk about a platinum coin for $1 trillion. That's only because there wasn't $1 trillion worth of platinum in there. It was because the government says it's worth $1 trillion. So it's by law. That's what it means by being fiat. Also, in order for that currency to have any value, the government has to put it out there to the people. Otherwise, they don't have any money. So the government has to dispense the money in order to provision itself. Government wants to build a road. They put out a contract, hire a company to build the road for them. They pay them. And now there's money in the economy. And it goes to everything the government does. The government will only pay in its own dollars. Now, this goes for other nations as well. It's not just the United States. In return, when the government issues that money, it also says, oh, by the way, when we give you this money, it's not free. You're going to have to pay taxes. So what that money is, in effect, is a tax credit. And when you pay it back in taxes, what you have done is zeroed out your tax obligation. So if you look at it from an accounting point of view, there's a credit given to you for all the money that you got is a credit with the government. Now you're going to pay back whatever they ask for. And so you need that money. That's where it gets its value. You need it to pay your taxes because the taxes are part of the fact the government is giving you money. And that is a really high overview of that. So all taxes are only collected in its own currency. The government only pays out whenever it pays out anything in its own currency. And this occurs in almost every nation in the world. There's some notable exceptions. The biggest one is the European Union, because they all are on the euro. And so Greece, for example, they used to have a drachma. That was their own currency, and they don't have it anymore. So they're dependent upon the European Central Bank to give them money. And so they're what's called a currency user, just as every one of us in the United States is a currency user. Also, the states and any other government agency that is not the federal government are currency users. So the states, when they tax, that's to provision themselves. They don't provision, they're not have the capability of saying, okay, we need to provision ourselves. Let's create some money. And actually, that's how money gets created, is on spending by the federal government.
Okay.
Not
Let me ask you
before, not after. Go ahead. Sure.
Let me ask you a question real quick. There's a question in the chat, and I'm curious about this. Creative Experiment said, if you understand MMT, you know you don't need Bitcoin, and that Bitcoin is a scam. Wanted to get your opinion about that.
I'm not an expert on Bitcoin, but I can tell you this. Bitcoin, in the way it's configured right now, is a commodity. It's like right now, gold is not backing our currency. It's a commodity. You buy it and you sell it. Well, that's what we do with Bitcoin. I mean, when people say it's worth a whole lot, it's because they can convert it to however much dollars it converts to.
Gotcha.
Okay.
Okay.
So
Okay. So how would we, in reference to MMT, one of the questions that I have to ask, because I've seen this come up a lot on Twitter. People who are opposed to this, why are they against it? What are some of the things that you see with MMT that is the reason why people may be against this and say, no, this isn't a good idea?
well, let me just take a little step backwards.
Mhm.
I kind of alluded to this, but essentially, the government does not use its tax collections to spend. The federal government does not spend its tax collections. It basically just wipes the book clean on the taxes due. The same thing happens with tariffs, fines, fees, all those things. Whatever your obligation to the government was, you wiped it out. All spending is new money. That's one of the foundational statements of modern monetary theory. So where people come in and talk about it, as objecting to it, they're usually not looking at the fact that the money has value due to the fact that it's taxed. And so they usually will believe that with MMT, by allowing the creation of more money as we go along, will cause inflation, high
Okay.
inflation. And that is the objection by most people who are not economists or familiar with MMT.
Okay.
The economists have another set of criteria that they attack MMT on. And not that they don't disagree with the common story that it's going to cause inflation, but they always kind of walk past that, and they go more towards things like, well, the government still has to borrow money when we run a deficit. So they're not saying the government is creating new money, are not creating new money, they're reusing money, yet they imply it, because the only reason you would need to borrow money is if you couldn't create it when you spend it. So MMT looks at the borrowing that is done is just actually, put it very simply, savings account. And in general, that's a savings account for rich people, where instead of paying a higher tax, and maybe I'll talk a little bit more about taxes on rich people, but instead of creating a higher tax, the rich people get to put their money with the government and collect interest. And you will hear a lot of economists talk about how we're going to drown in interest. That's because they know the money isn't really borrowed. So you've got to parse sometimes what they say to understand they are implying that the MMT assertions are correct without saying it because of what they object to. So there's a lot of misdirection going on by economists, and in particular by neoliberal economists, which cuts across Republican and Democrat just about everywhere. It doesn't matter what party you're in. Both parties are neoliberals by and large. And that's where the real criticism of MMT comes from. Wolf's criticisms are a lot less of an attack, as more of a kind of it's not what I'm talking about.
Okay, and by the way, he's talking about Professor Wolf, who was
Yes, I'm sorry
on here. Yeah. So would you say,
thinking back to earlier discussion, sorry.
Yeah, no worries. Would you say that so the one of the questions I have is this a top-down approach?
Well,
Is
it's
MMT
not.
a top?
Okay, as actually somebody in the chat kind of threw this across. It's not something that has to be developed or implemented. So top down, because it's macro, yes, because we're talking about the aggregate. So we're not worried about, well, $100 goes to building an airplane out of my taxes or whatever you want to call it, and $50 goes to this. It's the whole thing taken as a whole. And that sort of comes into play in a lot of ways when we talk about banking, which is not something I wanted to get into in this discussion, because it really goes into some of the weeds that will kind of muddy the waters, because we want to keep this at a higher level. But nonetheless, the idea of MMT being something to be implemented is kind of false. It's there. It's already being used. In fact, it's being used by the neoliberals. And they are intentionally giving out misinformation. This is where people get the idea that inflation's just around the corner, because the neoliberals want to protect their position of control within the political structure, the economic structure, and all that. I kind of look at neoliberalism and progressivism as two different economic philosophies. And neoliberalism, if you want to get into the subject of neoliberalism, or do you want to have some other questions before I get to there? Because I do want to cover that.
Yeah. Well, I do want to hear about that. And then also I wanted to ask, when you look at MMT and with neoliberalism, where does people like AOC, Bernie Sanders, where, in your opinion, where do they fit in all of this?
Well, AOC actually explicitly did say we need to look at MMT. She did say that once, maybe twice. However, she's never really pushed anything for it, or talked about it in any kind of depth. Bernie pretends it's a theory, and we can get into that a little later. But in that, he actually testified in the Senate, or not testified, but in a speech in the Senate when MMT was being attacked by Republicans and they were trying to outlaw it. which is kind of hard to do considering that it's just the way the system works. His argument against outlawing it was to say, but it's just a theory. Why? How can you outlaw just something that's just a theory? So he knows it, but nobody knows why he won't say it. It's Stephanie Kelton, who wrote a book that's recently had a lot of coverage. She's been getting a lot of time on the air on TV because of it. It's called The Deficit Myth.
Mhm.
And in it, she talks about everything MMT, but in particular, she brings out how the deficit, which I mentioned before, and the money that we borrow is just that, a myth. It's not anything to be concerned about. To be real simple about it, the debt, which is an accumulation of the deficits throughout history, the debt is nothing more than any money put into circulation by the government that has not yet been taxed back. So if we taxed back everything, we wouldn't have any money ourselves. So it's the money in your pocket is money that hasn't been taxed back. And that's really what the deficit is. It's the money that hasn't been taxed back this year.
Okay.
So Bernie is an enigma on this subject. On the other hand, John Armuth, who nobody ever heard of until a couple of months ago, is the House chairman of the Budget Committee, sort of Bernie's counterpart in the House.
Mm-hmm.
He has spoken explicitly about endorsing Stephanie Kelton's book and very explicitly laying out MMT during a couple of interviews. It's obvious he is on board. If I may take that one step further as to what's going on with Congress,
Mm-hmm.
one of the leading economists in MMT is a man named Randall Wray, and he's one of the early adopters. And he recently mentioned in a mackerel and cheese podcast that's on Real Progressives, and he mentioned that back in October of 2019, he was called before the House to testify. And he's done this before, and he thought, well, okay, I'll just put together the information I usually put together and talk to them about budget. Gets a phone call from one of the aides that says, don't bother doing what you usually do. They want to talk to you about MMT. And that's what they did. The House Budget Committee is aware of MMT. They're not talking about it except for the chairman. So there are congressmen that are very aware of MMT, and they're not talking about it because there's a stigma built around it. And I'm going to go back to the neoliberal thing. Where neoliberalism controls the economy in the United States, and they have the power and the authority to actually shut down any talk about MMT by congressmen. Not physical power, but they just could say, hey, don't tell people that the money is not their tax money, it's public money, because then they might want to use it for public purpose. So I think I answered the question a little bit more than you expected, but I think it was necessary to give a feel for how we're being misled by a lot of the people that most people take it all for granted.
I want to go to some of the questions in the chat. Christina T said, yep, the federal government having to balance the budget is a big lie. Some politicians want you to keep repeating slash believing. What's your opinion on that?
Um, I yeah, the politicians, most of them know, some of them don't know. I kind of agree with Stephanie Kelton's view on what politicians think, is that most of them don't really know because they don't really care.
Mm.
They just don't bother to look at it. They call up their favorite economists, ask their opinion, and they're all neoliberals, so they give you the neoliberal answer. Where I come from is more of they're being told that anything that is not advantageous to the neoliberals is not any good. And so balancing the budget is, there's a lot of, even for lack of a better term, liberal neoliberals, sort of like a Paul Krugman, who will say, no, we don't have to balance the budget now, but eventually we do have to deal with the debt. So he's talking out of both sides of his mouth. And the fact is, whether or not they're lying is kind of irrelevant. The point is, we're not hearing the truth, which is all spelled out in the deficit myth, where the deficit, if the deficit is not true, then the balancing a budget is not necessary. We don't have to, there's no reason for us to say, oh, we're going to collect as many taxes as we spent. We want the economy to grow. We got to leave some money in the economy for people to spend. If we don't have any more to spend, then what happens? Then what we had at the beginning of the year?
Yeah.
What happens to the economy? You
Yep.
can't. When there's any inflation at all, what happens? We're in trouble.
That's a good point. I want to give a shout out to Bad Mama Jamma for the super chat. Thank you so much. She said, said, thank you for giving a platform to MMT and understanding it is so crucial for a number of reasons. Love the show, Sabs. Thank you so much. And Delthea Simmons, who's a Sabby member, said, if you haven't read The Deficit Myth, please read it. Also, David Graeber's Debt, the First 5,000 Years. Thank you. I'll have to check those out. Are you familiar with I know you mentioned The Deficit Myth. Are you familiar with David Graeber?
No.
I'll have to.
The name of the book does sound familiar, so I think somebody has mentioned it previously, and maybe somebody in the chat would also know a little bit more about it.
Yeah. So I hope you guys all heard that. You heard it here. Balancing the budget is not necessary technically.
Yeah, and it's actually for the situation that we're in right now, where we're a net importer, not a good idea. If we were a net exporter, it'd be the other way around.
Gotcha.
So, but again, that's another subject that is deeper, and I will try to avoid it. Some of the things that I do want to talk about here is especially going with neoliberalism, and the reason is that when progressives mostly look at trying to figure out how to get something like Medicare for all done, Green New Deal, any of those things, even defund the police, but well, that gets a little more complicated. But the point here is that neoliberalism is based on a single-minded economic philosophy of free markets, which by itself cannot exist with any other kind of market idea or anything like that. So it does not accept socialism. It's capitalism and only capitalism. If you look at a lot of European countries, as neoliberalism is spreading to them, they're shrinking their social safety nets. This is the danger of growing neoliberalism. The
Yep.
clue that neoliberalism has hijacked MMT comes from the fact that it didn't take hold in America until Ronald Reagan came into office. And that was right after the inflation that was throughout the 70s, started during the Nixon administration. And Nixon is the one who took us off of the gold standard for solid economic reasons at the time. Our gold supply was under attack from Europe. They were trying to buy up all our gold, and with other issues going on as well. Anyways, the neoliberal ideas go back all the way to Goldwater, but they never grabbed hold. A few things under Nixon, yeah, maybe, but it didn't until they figured out MMT. Maybe not explicitly, not as much as detailed as Warren Mosler did later, but the basic concepts.
Mm-hmm.
And you may recall at some point that Dick Cheney said Ronald Reagan taught us that deficits don't matter. I don't know if anybody remembers that. He was
Oh God.
referencing neoliberalism's taking advantage of MMT. And now it wants to hold it for itself. So it doesn't want anyone to realize this is sort of a groupthink thing. It's not a bunch of guys sitting in a back room coming up with a conspiracy. It's just protecting their place in the economy, their philosophy of economics. There are true believers that really think that having the government hand over the reins to everything, such as charter schools, private prisons, even also our military to a large extent. I mean, we don't produce anything for our military without going outside.
Mm.
And there's just so many things that you can point at. Right now in the transportation bill or the infrastructure bills, they're doing it through private-public partnerships. Well, who always gets control when it's a private-public partnership? Private. They run it. And through a discussion the other day with the mayor in my city, I asked her about the situation. She's running for re-election. I asked her about the situation where there's very little low-income housing coming in. And she reminded me that back in the 70s or the 80s, a law was passed that basically outlawed the federal government from building low-income housing on its own. We used to have those projects back in the 50s. I remember visiting my grandparents in one, but for poor and elderly people. Now they're only through leases with private contractors.
Yep.
And they expire after 30 years, and then they can charge whatever they want for the rent. So that's a neoliberal idea that came through probably through the Reagan or Clinton administrations. And so they are trying to hold on to their power and their authority, even though a lot of things are happening that are chipping away at it.
Wow. I want to give a shout out to Misanthropic and Out of Coffee. It is easier to imagine the end of the world than to imagine the end of capitalism. That's from Frederick James. Thanks so much for the super chat. Um, where does, because I was thinking about this, when you think about UBI, where where does UBI fit in all of this? Because I want to get your opinion about this. How do you feel about UBI? Do you think that's something that could really help the economy? Or do you feel that that's really not the end all be all? Like that's not the right answer?
It's not the right answer.
Oh, this is
Um,
interesting.
uh, um, a UBI essentially gives everybody $1,000 a month or whatever it is. Nowhere near enough. If you're poor, it doesn't help you at all, period. If you're the middle class, hey, that's cool. But they're not the ones that need the help. We can get them help with lower taxes. So a better solution, a more dynamic solution, and one that really meets the criteria of MMT, sorry, the criteria of MMT to deal with the problem of possible inflation, because that's a core principle of MMT, is for a federal job guarantee. This was actually submitted as an idea, anyways, by Representative Ariana Presley in
Hmm.
Massachusetts. Um, and it's also embedded into the Green New Deal. What this is that local communities will have the authority to create jobs, and anybody who's unemployed for whatever reason can go and get a job in their community. And it usually would be public service type jobs of some sort. They, obviously, because it's part of the Green New Deal, it will also be green, which usually if you're just doing a service job, it's not a big thing, but it could also be helping to survey or build some parks or whatever. There will be, yes, Julie, you're absolutely correct. Universal basic services is obviously a better solution. That does not preclude, although for UBI, the federal job guarantee does not preclude some monetary help for people, but it's more of a means test, and it would probably, in my personal opinion, and I'm not, I need to hear what an economist would say about this.
Mhm.
It would seem to me that the idea is that it's a leveler with various costs of living in different parts of the country, different towns, so that you get that level playing field for people without giving the super wealthy $1,000 a month that they don't need. What will also happen is for like renters, a lot of landlords, especially the corporate ones, will say, hey, all my tenants are getting $1,000 extra a month. I can raise them by $500. I'm not taking it all.
I didn't think
And
about that.
yeah, it will. What it does is in the long term, because employers will also say, hey, my workers are getting $1,000 a month. I don't have to give them a 2% raise. I'll give them a 1% raise. Hey, I'm not taking it all.
Wow. See, this is a side of I'm glad you came on because this is a side of like UBI that I haven't heard that at all
Yeah,
yet. So
yeah,
this was interesting to hear.
yeah. And the job guarantee, just to close that out, to explain a little bit further on that, because it's a critical component of what MMT actually advocates for is an automatic stabilizer. Because when you hit a period of time where there's layoffs, which happens, it's cyclical, it happens in any economy. Everybody can go to public service, get paid a living wage, have full benefits, maybe learn a new trade, and not have to travel anywhere. Take a job only if they like it. It doesn't take away anything from other um, services.
Mm,
So if you're collecting HUD payments for your rent, that would continue. If you get food stamps, that would continue. You may not need it. So there could also be a lot of people who will actually take less services because they got a job. Jobs. Here's another really important thing about that. If you're a woman in an abusive relationship and you need to leave, you can go anywhere, get a job,
mm,
and be guaranteed you have a vacation, you will have health care, all the benefits are there in that. That's the plan. And just to close that out on the monetary side or the fiscal side, study was done by um, a number of economists. I believe Stephanie Kelton was one of them, and Pavlina Trineva was another. I forget, may have been Randall Ray was also involved in it. But they did an economic study, and it pays for itself. The
wow.
savings that it creates for society. Um, just think what it does for people's sense of well-being.
Wow. This is really
So that,
interesting. I want to share my screen really quick and I want to show people a picture of the guys that started this. Let me share my screen. And Brad, if you can tell everyone their names, go
absolutely.
my window here. Where did my window go? I have to pull it up. There we go. Because this, I mean, this has been getting a lot of buzz lately, and that's why I was just like, it'd be great to have someone come on to break it down. But these are the two gentlemen that started MMT, and what were their names, Brad?
The man on the left is Bill Mitchell. He's an Australian economist. He did a free online course about 6 months ago. I took that from him. It was online, and he was doing it at midnight or something, so it came across at the right time here. But nonetheless, it was a very good introductory class into modern monetary theory. Uh,
Cool.
Guy is really on it. He's an expert in uh, the euro and what
Hmm.
goes on there. He has his own opinions about a job guarantee, slightly different than the one that I'm drawing from, which is Pavlina Trineva. Um, and the other guy on the right is Warren Mosler. He's a hedge fund guy, an investor, and he was the American guy that came up with uh, a book called Seven Deadly Innocent Frauds. And he walks step by step through why everything that you know is wrong. Talks about banking, he talks about taxes and everything. And the guy is tried running for office a couple of times. Nobody believed that he actually knew how to, manage an economy. And yet they believed Donald Trump. Imagine that. But he's a very interesting character. Invented an automobile that they had to outlaw because it was so fast. It was winning too many races.
Wow.
But he's around. He tweets a lot. I think I mentioned to you when we spoke earlier, about 2 or 3 weeks ago, he gave a like to one of my tweets, and I'm like, wow, that's great. So he's very accessible, and Mitchell is well, not quite on social media, but he's around a lot.
Okay, I have there are two questions for you in the chat. The first one is from Dan. He says, "Why can't every country print as much as they want to buy all they want for their people?"
Oh, great question. Because there are limits. Yeah, every country could print, and actually we don't print. Nobody prints money. It's just a teeny piece of it. It's all electronic. But they could. Of course, in theory, the inflation people are correct. It will cause inflation. If we have too much money chasing too few resources, prices are going to be bid up and we'll get inflation. So, no, we can't. But that's part and parcel, very much embedded into MMT, is the idea of what constrains the spending. And part of it is the taxes.
Yeah.
Okay, we tax back the money. So we could print as much, but we've got to tax back enough so that the economy does not overextend itself. That's number one. Number two is inflation. Is the direct connection to that? Is it inflation itself? And that's where, as I mentioned before, a job guarantee comes into play, because it will. But I'm going to jump back over to neoliberals. Because they're always the bad guy. And what neoliberals have done is they have the Fed making monetary decisions, which are the interest rates and things like that, based on unemployment. And there's a magic number that the Fed is supposed to calculate to say, this is how much unemployment we should have. Sometimes it's 5%, sometimes it's 2%. Actually, nobody knows. Nobody's ever actually, as far as I know, laid out a actual calculation that you could plug in and know what that magic number is, which is when MMT comes in and says, well, in that case, let's just do 0. And that's part of the federal job guarantee. So what happens is, if you go over that, if you try to employ people more than want to work, you will get inflation.
Wow.
And
go ahead.
Yeah, and since what that's called, the calculation's called the NAIRU, non-accelerating inflation rate for unemployment. It's the point and what that really does is it provides a cushion for employers to keep the wages down. Because if everybody who wants a job has one, there's got to be a little bit of power for the employee. You're getting treated like crap. You got a job guarantee. You can go get a job. Maybe it's not going to pay as much, but you'll still be working while you're looking, and you can get a job.
Mm.
So it empowers employees, and neoliberalism will try to minimize the advantages of workers in the economy.
Another question for you is from Eric Thomas. He said, do you think the COVID stimulus checks made people realize that the government can give money out at any time it wants?
I don't know. I think that people are sensing that. There was an article I read today from Huffington Post talking about the current 3.5 trillion, which is really 350 billion a year, infrastructure plan, or whatever you want to call it, reconciliation bill. And they found that people who were for it, it didn't matter what the amount was. People who were against it, the cheaper it got, the more they were okay with it. So it depends on your starting point of what your mindset is. So in general, Republicans tend to be, and because it's Biden behind the bill, actually Bernie, but they tend to be against it because they will be against anything a Democrat does. And at the same time, the Democrats tend to be, doesn't matter how much it costs, I'm for it. So they go with the 3.6 trillion or whatever it is. And so the idea that people have got a hold of that idea, I don't know. I really don't know. It's something that a straw we're grasping at it right now is that maybe the time is ripe. And so that's a good reason for me to be here and talking to people about it. And hopefully the message is getting across that the wealthy are not our enemy. They're not our friends. But we're not going to get the money to pay for Medicare for All or Green New Deal or even initial funding for a federal job guarantee, as well as free college and all that, by taxing the rich. Why? Because that tax money goes nowhere. It just zeroes out and disappears. You need to get the idea across that the government can spend, and here's the other constraint, resources. We need to keep an eye on whether or not we have the resources available to do Medicare for All. And it's very possible, when you look into it deep enough, you're going to say, we don't have the hospital space. I mean, COVID kind of brought this type of thing up. We don't have the trained medical people.
Yeah.
But you see that because you're looking at the what you need to build that. And you say, hold it. Well, we can't do that because it'll cause inflation. If we go after resources that are not available, let's build out those resources that we need and then turn on Medicare for All. So there may be, or turn it on slower. So what it does is it lays out by looking through that MMT lens, which is the way you look at it, look at things. When you look through that lens and see how MMT operates and what you can use from seeing it that way, you realize how to implement your policies, not just whether you can afford it or not, because you can always afford it if you lay it out right.
Awesome. We're coming up on coming up to 7:54. I have one more question in the chat I wanted to direct to you. Greg said, are you familiar with the idea of the petrodollar and the idea that our currency is backed by oil imperialism?
No, I said the dollar is backed by its value of resources. It has nothing to do with oil imperialism. It has nothing to do, that doesn't mean oil imperialism doesn't exist. It doesn't change the value of the dollar. It doesn't impact it. Also, the value of the dollar, like I said, is because you need it to pay taxes, not because you need it to buy gas. Yeah, you do, but that's microeconomics.
Gotcha. I want to say thanks so much to Double K for the super sticker, for all your super stickers tonight. We have about 4 minutes left. Is there anything else you want to touch on for MMT, Brad? I want to make sure you get to any other points that you wanted to talk about.
Really, I think at this point, I'm good with just doing a couple of plugs here, if you don't mind. And I did mention this earlier, but I'm going to mention it again. Realprogressives.org is Real Progressives' website. There is a ton of information, articles, and papers, and all kinds of videos. Almost everything Steve has done, and a great resource for learning about MMT, and also for reading a lot of articles written by many of the members of RP, including myself, which I'm going to put in a plug for. That I have an article that will be posted. I don't have the time frame. It will be either tonight or tomorrow. It's called the MMT Lens. At least that's what I named it. I don't think it's been changed. That touches on a lot of the stuff that I spoke about, and some of it goes into a little bit more detail on that. And I think it would really be helpful for a lot of people who watch this to check out that article. And that will be on the Real Progressive site tomorrow at the latest. It will also be a couple of days later, go on my personal website, giveUstruth.com, and so you can also take a look at it there as well. And also, one last little plug for RP. In another hour, Jordan Cheriton will be on RP Live on Zoom, and it will be a open to all kind of, here we go. Our chief editor-in-chief just announced that the article is published. Thanks, Jamari. And like I said, the 9 o'clock, check out Real Progressives on Facebook, and the links will be there. If somebody can throw that up on the chat, that'd be good. And I want to thank you for giving me this opportunity to talk, and be willing to come again whenever you want. And if you want to get a hold of somebody or more knowledgeable in some of the other areas, we have a lot of people available. I'm sure Steve Grumbine would be very interested in chatting with you. He has a little more practice at doing public presentations than I do.
Yeah, and also want to shout out Macro and Cheese podcast as well.
Yes,
Also
yes,
part of Real
Julie,
Progressives.
absolutely.
Yeah, that's good times. One of my comrades of FHL was also a part of Macro and Cheese podcast, so they do great things over there as well.
Yep.
Awesome, Brad. Thanks so much for coming on. I'll talk to you again later. I'm going to wrap things up with them here, but thanks so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure.
Bye.
Bye.
All right, guys. I'm not going to keep you much longer, but I do have some updates for you and a special announcement. All right, 86 Blackberry White. That name just cracks me up. I'm sorry. Blackberry White. Thanks for the plug, Sabby Sabs and Brad. Yeah, really like educational, you guys. Like I knew a little bit about it, but I didn't know enough about it to explain it to you guys, just keeping it real. So that was really educational. Have a couple of updates for you. One and foremost, if you have not noticed, I do want to announce that Fred Hampton Leftist Podcast has just crossed 8,000 subscribers, you guys. We just crossed 8,000. So it's thanks to all of you guys and your friends and everyone that you've been telling about us at FHL. I guess we must be doing something right. But yeah, we really are growing. So thank you guys so much for all of your support. Really appreciate that. Tomorrow we have the Fred Hampton Leftist Roundtable at 4 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. So check that out. So, I won't do a video on my channel tomorrow on Thursdays because that's usually when I'm over on Roundtable. And then tomorrow evening at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, I will be on Killjoy Meg's podcast. We are going to be talking about millennials, our generation. So join me for a fun discussion that should be pretty interesting. And then Friday, catch me back here at 7 p.m. That's my fun show. I might have a beer again this time, you guys. That was kind of fun to do that last time. And at 4 p.m. Friday, I will do a Sabby Sab show on FHL as well. But again, thank you guys so much for all your support. We are on our way to 10,000. And I believe I'm going to make a prediction here. You guys can write this down. And if I'm wrong, I'll come back and I'll eat my words. I'm going to make a prediction. I predict that we can get to 10K by December. What do you guys think? Do you think that's too ambitious for me? I don't know. We might get there. We might get there. Lost Adult said you got the Tim Black bump. Oh man, that's funny. Sooner? Dan, you think sooner than that? I didn't want to, be too ambitious. Greg said you can do that easily. Wow, you guys have a lot of faith in me. Oh boy, we'll see. Where Pilgrim says maybe by the end of September, who knows? Oh, this is interesting. The heat, the heat. Michael Brown says not too ambitious at all. Oh gosh. Yeah. So I'm not going to keep you guys any longer. Check out Roundtable tomorrow, 4 p.m. over at FHL. And again, we just crossed 8,000 subs. Thank you so much for all your support. And as usual, as you always know, have a good night. Keep up the fight.